The fine rain falling on Fifth Avenue was no match for the city's movement. The mirrored glass buildings reflected the nightlights as the last executives left their offices, rushing to escape the traffic that refused to give way. On the 28th floor of one financial center, however, a light still burned stubbornly in the farthest corner of the main office. Mercedes Bernier pushed the cleaning cart down the long corridor, her steps heavy with more than just physical exhaustion. Her belly, already rounded at 5 months, demanded breaks she tried to disguise as part of the work. She would stop, take a deep breath, lean her hand on the cold wall and move on. She had to finish the floor before midnight, catch the last bus, and still call her mother before she went to sleep. She leaned the phone on her shoulder, holding it with her tilted head, while wiping the cloth over the glass table in the meeting room. "Mom, calm down, I already told you everything's fine," she said, trying to put into her voice a firmness she didn't feel. On the other end of the line in Stoneville, Mylene Olson insisted, worried about the silence in her daughter's recent calls. "Mercedes Bernier, I've known you since you were born. No use hiding from me, you're not well." "Everything's fine, Mom, it's just the pregnancy fatigue." Her voice cracked mid-sentence and she bit her lip, trying to recompose her tone before continuing. "I'll figure it out, okay? I always do." "Figure out what, my daughter? Talk to me?" Mercedes Bernier closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't want to tell her about the eviction notice she'd received 3 days earlier, about the overdue rent for the tiny room she shared with another cleaning lady on the east side, about the bills piling up like a wall about to collapse on her. She didn't want her mother, already frail and unable to help, to carry that extra weight from so far away. "It's work, Mom, that's all. Tomorrow I'll call you calmly and tell you the news," she lied, trying to sound light. "Jose Mueller is fine, moving around a lot today." Upon hearing the name of the grandchild who hadn't even been born yet, Mylene Olson softened her voice, and for a few minutes the two talked about the baby Layette, about the name Mercedes Bernier had chosen in honor of her grandfather, about small memories that alleviated, even if briefly, the weight of reality. When she finally hung up, Mercedes Bernier stood still, looking at her own reflection in the dark glass of the meeting room, trying to find within herself the solution she had promised her mother existed. She put the phone in her apron pocket and stood there for a few more seconds, leaning against the glass table, trying to organize in her mind the list of problems she needed to solve before the end of the week. The eviction notice was folded in her bag, along with her nearly empty wallet. Shakira Reynolds, the colleague with whom she shared the tiny rented room on the east side, had already warned that she couldn't keep covering the difference on the overdue rent alone. Mercedes Bernier understood her friend. Shakira Reynolds was also strapped, also supporting her own family on the uncertain salary of a cleaning woman. But that didn't make the situation any less desperate. She ran her hand over her belly, an almost automatic gesture she made whenever anxiety grew too much. "We'll figure it out, Jose Mueller," she whispered softly, as if her son could somehow feel that comfort she herself couldn't feel. She was 27 years old, a whole life of hard work ahead, and despite everything, a rooted stubbornness that kept her from allowing herself to give up. She had left Stoneville 5 years earlier, in search of better opportunities in New York City, and she did not intend to return defeated, much less allow her son to grow up hearing stories of failure. She returned to work, cleaning the surfaces with her usual care, even though her mind was miles away, trying to calculate how many extra shifts she would need to cover the next rent, how many baby clothes were still missing, how much longer her own body could endure this pace without proper rest. She didn't know that, just a few feet away, someone had heard every word. Lorenzo Barton was in the adjoining room, the door ajar, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen, but his mind had stopped processing numbers minutes ago. He owned that floor, that building, a sizable chunk of that neighborhood, but at that hour, alone, as always, he felt like just a man unwillingly overhearing the quiet desperation of a woman trying to shield her own mother from the truth. He knew Mercedes Bernier by sight. A quick "good morning" exchanged in the service elevator, a brief thank you when she left his office spotless before he arrived in the morning. He had never stopped to imagine her life beyond those walls. In fact, he found it strange how much it bothered him now. The trembling tone of her voice, the attempt to sound strong, the silence that followed when she thought she was alone. He closed the laptop slowly, as if the gesture could muffle the noise of his own thoughts. For years he had lived alone in the penthouse in Beverly Hills, a generously proportioned apartment that echoed empty every night. He had meetings, contracts, trips, decisions that moved millions. But he hadn't had in a long time a conversation like the one he had just overheard. A conversation between people who genuinely care about someone. He stood up, walked to the door, but stopped before opening it. What would he say? What kind of man suddenly appears to say, "I heard everything"? He stepped back, sat down again, tried to get back to work. He couldn't. Mercedes's words echoed, "I'll figure it out, Mom, I always do." There was a dignity in that which struck him with unexpected force. Nearly an hour passed before he heard the sound of the cleaning cart, moving away down the hall, a sign that Mercedes was heading to the next floor. Lorenzo stayed there, motionless, staring at the city through the glass, the lights of New York City spreading out like a map of lives he had never bothered to consider. The next morning he arrived at the office earlier than usual. Samantha, his secretary, found it odd. Lorenzo rarely showed up before 9, and there he was at 7:30, reviewing files he already knew by heart, just to have a reason to be present. "Good morning, Mr. Barton. Did something happen?" she asked, curious. "No, Samantha. I just decided to get a jump on things," he replied evasively, unable to explain even to himself what was really driving him. Throughout the day he found himself watching the hallways with an interest he hadn't felt in years, trying to spot, among the cleaning staff shifting from shift to shift, the woman from the night before. He felt ridiculous, a 34-year-old businessman, owner of one of the country's largest construction companies, losing focus in important meetings because of a conversation he shouldn't have heard in the first place. Derek Wysosk, his longtime partner and friend, noticed the distraction during the afternoon meeting. "Are you with us, Lorenzo?" he teased, tapping his pen on the table. "I repeated the numbers from the partnership with the investment fund 3 times. "Sorry, my mind's elsewhere," Lorenzo admitted without going into detail. "That's new. You distracted." "Must be serious," Derek insisted, smiling, not realizing how much truer that statement would become over time, beyond any casual joke. Lorenzo didn't answer. He ended the meeting early, claiming exhaustion, and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince himself that it was nothing more than a passing curiosity, a remnant of a conscience bothered by witnessing someone else's suffering. But that night, when the building emptied again and the cleaning crew arrived for the night shift, he found himself watching through the half-open door, waiting to recognize Mercedes's footsteps in the hallway. She arrived around 9 o'clock, the same cart, the same grey uniform from the outsourced company, the same fatigue disguised in automatic movements. This time, though, she wasn't on the phone. She worked in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding, perhaps without knowing why, meeting the gaze of anyone still on the floor. Lorenzo watched her organize the cleaning supplies in the service closet, saw her press a hand to her lower back for a moment. A small gesture from someone feeling the weight of an advanced pregnancy added to the weight of everything else she carried alone. He felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. It wasn't pity, or maybe it was, but mixed with something deeper, a recognition of a strength he wasn't sure he possessed himself. He spent almost the entire night at the office, not because he had pending work, but because he couldn't shake the thought that, just a few meters away, a pregnant woman alone was about to lose the only roof she had left, and he, with all the resources he possessed, still didn't know how or whether he should approach. It was only when he saw Mercedes leave, already in the early hours, walking through the fine drizzle to the bus stop on the corner, without an umbrella, without hurrying to take shelter, because there was nothing left waiting for her, beyond a room that would soon no longer be hers, that Lorenzo made the first decision of that story. He needed to do something. He didn't yet know what or how, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending that none of it had touched him. The next morning, he asked Samantha for the contact information of the outsourced company responsible for the building's cleaning. He justified the request with some excuse about a service complaint, but what he really wanted was a single piece of data: Mercedes' full name and the time she usually ended her shift. He didn't imagine at that moment that that small decision would change not only Mercedes's life but his own, in a way that no negotiation, no multi-million-dollar contract had ever managed. Samantha handed him the information without asking questions, accustomed to attending to unusual requests from the boss without questioning the motives. Lorenzo read the full name, Mercedes Bernier, and felt, for an instant, like an intruder invading a life that didn't belong to him. He almost gave up right there, almost tore up the paper, and returned to the safe routine of spreadsheets and meetings. But the memory of the trembling voice on the phone, of the promise made to her own mother, of the tired gesture of pressing a hand to her back wouldn't let him retreat. That night, sitting alone in the penthouse, looking at the flawless cold furniture that never seemed truly inhabited, Lorenzo allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, a thought that didn't revolve around numbers or goals. Maybe there existed in life something more important than expanding empires. Maybe he himself, without realizing it, also needed someone to bring warmth to so much emptiness. The city carried on at its usual pace, indifferent to the small revolutions unfolding inside its glass towers. But on that 28th floor, something was quietly beginning to change. The first thread of a story that, even before truly beginning, already carried the weight of an encounter neither of them had planned, but that both in very different ways needed. Mercedes Bernier received the note the next morning, left by Samantha in the supply closet, asking her to stop by Mr. Barton's office before starting her shift. Her heart immediately raced. Cleaning ladies weren't called to the executive suite except to receive bad news. A complaint, a contract termination, the end of what little they already had. She nervously ran her hand over her uniform, trying to smooth the wrinkles left by accumulated fatigue, and walked down the hall with steps that felt heavier than usual. She knocked softly on the half-open door. "Excuse me, you called for me?" Lorenzo looked up from his computer screen and, for a moment, couldn't find the words he'd rehearsed all night. Before him stood the woman with the trembling voice on the phone, now with a face tight with apprehension, tired eyes, but still steady, bracing for the worst. "Yes, please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Mercedes hesitated, not understanding why a businessman like him would treat her with such formality, but she obeyed, sitting on the edge of the chair, ready to get up at any sign of dismissal. "I'll be direct," Lorenzo began, still unsure how to proceed without sounding intrusive. "Last night I accidentally overheard part of your phone conversation. It wasn't my intention to listen, but it happened, and I can't pretend I didn't hear it." Mercedes's blood ran cold. Shame rose to her face before she could control her reaction. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Barton. It won't happen again. I know I shouldn't use my phone during work hours." "That's not what this is about," Lorenzo interrupted gently but firmly. "It's about what I heard, about your situation. The rent, the eviction, all of it." Mercedes looked down, feeling a mix of humiliation and anger at having her privacy exposed like that, even if unintentionally. "That's my problem, sir. You don't need to worry." "I know I don't," he replied, and there was a sincerity in his words that caught her off guard. "But I want to." "Mercedes, I spent last night thinking about it, and I've come to a decision. I'd like to pay off your rent debt and, while you get your life sorted, offer you a room in my penthouse so you and your son have a safe place to stay." The silence that settled in the room seemed to last an eternity. Mercedes stared at him, as if he were speaking another language, trying to find some malicious logic behind that absurd proposal. "You barely know me," she finally said, her voice thick with disbelief and indignation. "I can't accept that. It's not right. People will think." "I'm not worried about what people will think," Lorenzo cut in. "I'm worried about the fact that you're pregnant, about to lose your home and have nowhere to go. That's what matters now." Mercedes stood up abruptly, walking to the window, her arms crossed over her belly in an instinctive gesture of protection. "You don't understand. I work hard for my independence. If I accept this, I'll just become another person relying on some rich man's charity. I don't want that for my son. I don't want him to grow up thinking his mother only survived because someone showed up to fix everything." Lorenzo watched her in silence, recognizing in her words a pride he knew well himself, though applied differently in his own life. He stood up as well, moving closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I understand more than you think," he said, his voice lower now. "And that's exactly why I'm not offering you eternal charity, Mercedes. I'm offering you time. Time for you to get organized, save money, find a real place for you and Jose, without the weight of having to figure everything out at once, in a hurry. risking settling for anything because you have no other way out. The mention of her son's name, spoken with an unexpected care, broke through part of Mercedes's resistance. She turned to face him, trying to understand what kind of man this was, one who seemed genuinely affected by the situation of an employee he barely knew. "And if I accept, what are the conditions?" she asked, cautious, determined not to be fooled by generosity without clear terms. "None other than you keep working if you want, or rest if you need, taking care of your health and the babies. The room is yours as long as you need it. I won't charge rent, I won't interfere in your routine, and you can leave whenever you want, without owing anyone an explanation." Mercedes was silent for a long moment, weighing every word, searching for traps she couldn't find. She knew that accepting meant giving up part of the control she fought so hard to maintain, but she also knew that refusing would most likely mean ending the week with no fixed address, 7 months pregnant, with no support network in the big city. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, unable to hold back the question that bothered her most. "You don't know me. I'm just one more employee among so many in this building." Lorenzo took a moment to answer, as if the question had caught him off guard, even though he had asked himself the same thing all night. "I can't really explain," he admitted, with a sincerity he rarely allowed himself to show. "I just know that when I heard you trying to hide your fear from your mother, trying to act strong for someone you love, I realized I couldn't go on with my day as if nothing had happened. Maybe it's simply this. I have the means to help, and turning my back suddenly seemed unforgivable." The answer didn't completely dispel Mercedes's doubts, but there was an honesty in it that made it harder to distrust his intentions. Still, she crossed her arms, determined not to give in easily. "I need this to be clear. I'm not someone who needs to be saved, Mr. Barton. I'm just going through a rough patch. That doesn't make me helpless." "I never thought it did," Lorenzo replied, and for the first time he smiled, a small, almost shy smile so unusual on his face that even Samantha, if she were there, would probably have found it strange. "Actually, it's the opposite. It was your strength that made me want to help." "I need to think," she said at last, her voice more controlled. "And if I accept, I want to make one thing clear. It's not forever. As soon as I can get myself organized, I'll leave. And I'll keep working, saving my money, looking for a place for me and Jose. I don't want to owe this to anyone." "Deal," Lorenzo answered, feeling an inexplicable relief at that response, as if he had feared more than he'd like to admit that she would refuse. Mercedes left the room with her head spinning, unable to fully process what had just happened. She spent the rest of her shift in silence, mentally replaying every word of the conversation, trying to understand if she was making the right decision or was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She called Shakira Reynolds during her break, telling her everything in detail, hoping perhaps that her friend would convince her to refuse. "Mercedes Bernier, are you crazy to think twice about this?" said Shakira Reynolds categorically. "You're pregnant with no place to live, and a guy offers help without asking anything in return. Accept it, woman. Later you'll figure it out to leave, but now you need a roof." "And if he wants something later?" asked Mercedes Bernier, still suspicious. "Then you leave the way you came in. But don't refuse help out of pride when you have a child to protect." Her friend's words echoed throughout the afternoon, and when Mercedes Bernier finally decided to accept the proposal, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension, like someone jumping into a river of uncertain currents, trusting that she would know how to swim to the other bank before the water dragged her too far away. The next morning, she communicated her decision to Lorenzo Barton via a short and objective message, avoiding any contact that might seem like excessive gratitude or weakness. He only responded by confirming the address and the time she could move in, without adding comments that could sound like victory or control. On the afternoon of the move, Mercedes Bernier arrived at the Beverly Hills penthouse, carrying 2 worn-out suitcases and a bundle of baby clothes she had already bought piece by piece, taking advantage of thrift store sales. The contrast between her modest belongings and the cold grandeur of the apartment made her feel for a moment a tightness in her chest, not of gratitude, but of redoubled determination. This was temporary. She needed to remember that every day so as not to get lost in the comfort of a roof that was not truly hers. Lorenzo Barton received her discreetly, showing her the reserved room, a spacious room empty of meaning, decorated with the same impersonal style as the rest of the house. He explained where the essential things were, handed over a copy of the key, and before retreating to his own room, stopped at the door. "Make yourself at home, Mercedes Bernier. This house is now yours too, for as long as you need." She thanked him with a brief nod, but as soon as she was alone, she sat on the new bed, looking around that strange space she would temporarily call home, and made a silent promise to herself. She would save every possible penny from her salary, research cheaper neighborhoods once she had free time, and leave there with her head held high before that generosity turned into something she could no longer control. On the other side of the apartment, Lorenzo Barton stood by the large living room window, watching the lights of the city, feeling for the first time in a long time that huge and silent space might, finally, gain a bit of life. Derek Wissosk called shortly after, asking if the business dinner scheduled for the next day was still on. Lorenzo Barton confirmed, distracted, without mentioning anything about the new resident of the penthouse. He didn't yet know how to explain that decision to anyone, much less justify it to himself in terms that made logical sense. He only knew that when he closed his eyes that night, for the first time in a long time, the silence of the apartment didn't seem so absolute. There was, somewhere beyond the wall, a breath different from his own, and that, in some way difficult to name, brought a comfort he hadn't felt in years. Mercedes Bernier, for her part, barely managed to sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the strange sounds of that silent apartment, so different from the constant noise of the street where she used to live. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling Jose Mueller move, and whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "This is just a stop, son. We're going to build our own path, I promise." Before finally falling asleep, she made a quick mental calculation of how much she could save in the first week alone, determined not to let gratitude turn into complacency. She needed more than ever to keep her feet on the ground, even though she was now so many floors above the reality she knew. The first weeks in the penthouse were marked by a polite silence between the two, each respecting the other's space, as if walking on a glass floor that could crack at any misstep. Mercedes Bernier left early for work, avoided crossing paths with Lorenzo Barton in the morning, and returned late at night, when he was already locked in his home office, buried in reports that seemed never to end. During those first days, they barely exchanged more than brief greetings and practical questions about schedules and household needs. But there was something about Mercedes Bernier's presence that, little by little, began to seep into that once so sterile apartment. One Saturday morning, Lorenzo Barton woke up to a smell he hadn't felt within those walls in years: fresh coffee mixed with the aroma of warm bread. He walked to the kitchen, finding Mercedes Bernier sitting at the table, a cup in her hands, looking out the window with a thoughtful expression. "Good morning," she said, a little sheepishly, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. "I hope you don't mind. I can't sleep properly if I don't have coffee in the morning, and I saw that your fridge only had those little bottles of weird supplement." Lorenzo Barton smiled, a genuine smile that rarely appeared on his face so early in the morning. "I don't mind, actually." He hesitated, looking at the improvised coffee maker with a paper filter that she had bought with her own money. "It's been a long time since this kitchen was really used." "I noticed that," replied Mercedes Bernier with a half-smile. There was more dust in the cabinets than ingredients. That same Saturday, while they had breakfast in silence, Mercedes Bernier noticed for the first time how the penthouse, despite all its sophistication, seemed stripped of any personal touch. There were no photographs on the wall, no object that told a story, no travel souvenir or family memento. Everything there seemed to have been chosen by a hired decorator, functional and elegant, but soulless. "Can I ask you something?" she said, gathering courage. "How long have you lived here alone?" "4 years," replied Lorenzo Barton, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time through someone else's eyes. "I bought it when the company really started to grow. I thought I needed a place worthy of what I was building." "And is it worthy?" asked Mercedes Bernier without malice, just genuine curiosity. Lorenzo Barton did not answer immediately. He looked at the white walls, at the impeccable furniture that never seemed truly used, and finally shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but loaded with honesty. "No, I don't think it ever was." From that day on, small habits began to form. Mercedes Bernier, who had always liked to cook even though in recent years she rarely had the time or ingredients for it, started preparing simple meals that she left ready before leaving for work. At first, she did it thinking only about saving money, avoiding spending on ready-made food, but little by little she realized that she also liked seeing the kitchen table stop being an empty, cold space, gaining smell and color. Lorenzo, who for years had lived off delivery meals or quick dishes prepared by a cook, who came only twice a week, began to look forward, without admitting it out loud, to the moment he came home and found something different waiting for him. A steak with onions, rice seasoned with a touch that reminded him of home cooking, a simple dessert made with seasonal fruit. "You don't have to cook for me," he said one night, finding a covered plate left on the stove. "I don't want you to feel obligated to do any of this." "I know I don't have to," Mercedes replied, not looking away from the sink where she was washing dishes. "But I like doing it. Besides, cooking for two costs the same as cooking for just me, so it's no sacrifice at all." The practical answer hid something deeper, that even she wouldn't fully admit to herself. She liked the routine, the feeling of purpose that went beyond the cleaning work she did at the office. Cooking for someone, taking care of a space, bringing life to forgotten rooms. All of it awakened in her a sense of meaning that made her forget, if only for a moment, the weight of the uncertainties she carried. Little by little, the conversations between the two also grew more frequent and less formal. Lorenzo began coming home from work earlier, finding simple excuses to be around when Mercedes finished tidying the kitchen. He asked about Stoneville, about her childhood in the interior of Minas Gerais, about the dreams she'd had before moving to New York City. Mercedes, surprised by the genuine interest, gradually opened up, telling him about her mother, about the father who had left when she was still a child, about the determination that had always stayed with her from a young age. "And you, Lorenzo?" she asked one of those nights, while organizing the spices in a cabinet that had once held only empty jars. "You never talk about your family. Do you have parents? Siblings?" Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, unaccustomed to that kind of question. "I have a sister, Patricia. My parents live upstate on a farm they bought after the family business grew. We don't talk much. Everyone went their own way. And you never felt the urge to have a family of your own? A full house like this one could be?" Mercedes asked, then immediately regretted the overly personal question, afraid she had crossed an invisible line. Lorenzo was silent for a long moment, looking around the kitchen, which for the first time in years seemed truly lived in. "I always prioritized work," he finally replied. "I convinced myself that was enough, but lately I've been realizing maybe I was wrong." The comment hung in the air longer than either of them expected, heavy with a meaning neither was ready to fully name. Mercedes looked away, pretending to focus on the spice jars, while Lorenzo stood up, ending the conversation before it could move into even more delicate territory. As the weeks passed, the penthouse slowly accumulated small touches that reflected Mercedes' presence. A plant she'd bought at the market and placed on the balcony, a colorful tablecloth replacing the previous one, drab and gray like everything else in the apartment. Samantha, who occasionally brought documents to the boss's home, commented on the change with surprise. "Wow, Mr. Barton, this apartment looks like a different place. Even you seem different, if you don't mind me saying." Lorenzo Barton just smiled, without giving details, but internally acknowledging the truth of that observation. He arrived home with more enthusiasm, slept better, felt less alone even in the moments when Mercedes Bernier was just in the next room, without exchanging a single word. The simple certainty that there was another presence there, another life unfolding in that space, brought a comfort he had never experienced, even surrounded by material achievements that most people would envy. Mercedes Bernier, for her part, remained faithful to the purpose she had established from the first day. She saved part of her salary in a separate account, researched during work breaks for cheaper rental listings in outlying neighborhoods, mentally calculated how much longer she would need that temporary help before she could support herself completely alone. She didn't allow the growing comfort of living together to make her forget that this was not, and should never become, her permanent place. Still, she couldn't deny that something was changing inside her as well. The loneliness that had always accompanied her since she arrived in the big city, far from her mother and the few childhood friendships, was beginning to be filled by those nightly conversations, by that attentive look that Lorenzo Barton would cast whenever she showed excessive fatigue, by a kind of silent care he offered without ever seeming invasive. At least, not yet. One night when Mercedes Bernier came home from work visibly paler than usual, complaining of dizziness, Lorenzo Barton insisted she sit down, brought a glass of water, and stayed nearby until the color returned to her face. The gesture, simple and immediate, revealed a genuine concern that Mercedes Bernier couldn't help but notice. "You need to take better care of yourself, Mercedes Bernier. When was the last time you had a real prenatal checkup, with exams, ultrasound, everything properly done?" The question caught Mercedes Bernier off guard, and the silence that followed was answer enough. Amid the debts, the changes of address, and the daily rush, proper medical follow-up had taken a back seat, reduced to quick, irregular visits to the nearest health clinic, whenever there was time available in the waiting line. Lorenzo Barton watched her in silence, feeling a new determination grow inside him, unlike anything he had ever felt before. No longer just the desire to help out of compassion, but a nearly visceral will to ensure that that pregnancy, that baby who was already beginning to occupy an important space in his own thoughts, received all the care it deserved. "I'll schedule a private appointment for you," he said with a firmness that left no room for refusal. "With a good obstetrician, the necessary tests, everything proper. That's not too much generosity, Mercedes Bernier. It's the least that Jose Mueller deserves." For the first time since she had moved into the penthouse, Mercedes Bernier found no arguments to refuse. In that concern, there was something that surpassed any discomfort about depending on others' help. There, in that, was the well-being of the son she was carrying, and for him, she decided, it was worth accepting this further gesture of care, even if it meant opening up a little more the space she tried to keep closed between her and that man, who day after day seemed to become less of a stranger and more someone whose presence, unexpectedly, was already missed when absent. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes slightly teary, more from accumulated exhaustion than from sadness itself. "I know I keep repeating this all the time, but I really don't know what would have happened to me and Jose Mueller if you hadn't shown up." "No need to thank me," Lorenzo replied, sitting down beside her on the sofa, keeping a careful, respectful distance. "And, Mercedes, I think we can drop the Mr. Barton now, don't you? After everything, you can just call me Lorenzo." She smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and nodded, feeling that this small gesture of informality sealed, in some silent way, a closeness that could no longer be denied. That night, lying in her room, she still heard his footsteps in the hallway for a moment, the soft sound of the door closing, and allowed herself for a few brief seconds before falling asleep to imagine what it would be like if this arrangement weren't, in fact, temporary. She startled at the thought and quickly pushed it away, remembering the promise she had made to herself, not to get too comfortable, not to grow attached beyond what was necessary, to keep her eyes fixed on the goal of rebuilding, with her own hands, a life she could call entirely her own. On Thursday morning, Mercedes woke up earlier than usual, unable to fall back asleep once anxiety had taken hold. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, mentally running through the list of questions she wanted to ask the doctor, trying not to let expectation get the better of her. She had had an ultrasound before, early in the pregnancy, in a crowded clinic with an old machine and a rushed technician who barely had time to explain what appeared on the screen. This private appointment, so different from everything she knew, stirred conflicting feelings in her, gratitude for the opportunity and a certain unease at depending once again on Lorenzo's generosity for something as important as the health of her own child. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed for work, hurriedly drinking coffee while checking messages on his phone. "Good morning," he said, pocketing the device as soon as he saw her come in. "Sleep well?" "Sort of," Mercedes admitted, pouring herself a glass of water. "I've been thinking about the appointment all morning. Everything will be fine," Lorenzo said with a certainty that seemed to surprise even himself, as if he were trying to convince not only Mercedes, but also himself. "Helen is one of the best obstetricians in the city. Derek recommended her. His wife did her entire prenatal care with her. Mercedes nodded, still tense, and the two of them walked together to the car in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, only charged with an expectation neither of them could fully name. The appointment was scheduled for that Thursday afternoon, at an obstetrics clinic in the neighborhood of the Meadows, so different from the crowded public clinics Mercedes was used to that she almost felt out of place walking into the bright, quiet reception area. Lorenzo had insisted on accompanying her, claiming he needed to speak personally with the doctor about the pregnancy history, but Mercedes suspected the real reason was a concern he still didn't know how to put into words. "You didn't have to come," she said as they waited in the waiting room, flipping distractedly through a magazine she wasn't really reading. "I can handle these things on my own." "I know you can," Lorenzo replied without taking his eyes off the closed door of the exam room, "but I wanted to come." The simple answer, without further justification, silenced any other protest Mercedes might have voiced. There was, in his voice, a sincerity that no longer surprised her as it had at first, but still left her unsure of exactly how to react. When they were finally called in, Dr. Helen Noguera, a middle-aged obstetrician with a warm smile, received them in the office filled with modern equipment. She quickly reviewed the few tests Mercedes Bernier had brought from the clinic, asked a series of questions about symptoms, diet, routine, and finally shook her head gently at the obvious gaps in the follow-up care. "We're going to need to update quite a bit," the doctor said, her voice free of judgment, simply stating facts. "It's been a while since you had a full morphology ultrasound. Let's take advantage of you being here and do one right now, to make sure everything is fine with the baby." Mercedes Bernier felt her heart race. A mix of anxiety and anticipation she'd known from friends' previous pregnancies, but was now experiencing for the first time in her own skin. She lay down on the indicated stretcher, lifting her shirt to expose her already round belly, while Dr. Helen prepared the ultrasound machine. Lorenzo Barton remained standing a little apart, unsure of his place in such an intimate moment, but when the doctor discreetly gestured that he could come closer, he stepped forward, stopping beside the stretcher, his eyes fixed on the still dark monitor screen. The cold gel drew a small shiver from Mercedes Bernier, who laughed softly, trying to ease her own tension. Dr. Helen positioned the transducer on her belly, and a few seconds later, the screen came to life with grey-toned images that, to untrained eyes, looked like abstract shapes but quickly revealed themselves to be a small moving body. "There he is," the doctor said, smiling, adjusting the image. "Very active, look at that." Mercedes Bernier held her breath, her eyes welling up at the sight. Even though this was her second time seeing her own child this way, it still carried an overwhelming emotional impact. Beside her, Lorenzo Barton remained completely silent, his eyes fixed on the screen, unable to look away from that tiny figure that moved, turned, stretched its minuscule arms as if exploring its own space. "Do you want to know the sex?" Dr. Helen asked, the transducer still positioned, searching for the best angle. Mercedes Bernier glanced quickly at Lorenzo Barton, an almost automatic gesture of seeking approval or company for that decision, and he nodded, encouraging her to answer. "Yes, please," Mercedes Bernier said, her voice trembling with expectation. A few seconds of silence passed as the doctor adjusted the image, until finally she smiled, turning the screen slightly so both could see clearly. "Congratulations, it's a boy." The confirmation, though expected, since Mercedes Bernier had chosen the name Jose Mueller long before that exam, practically by maternal intuition, brought a wave of emotion she couldn't contain. Tears streamed down her face, and she laughed at the same time, a mix of relief and pure happiness she rarely allowed herself to feel amid so many practical worries. Then Dr. Helen, moving the transducer gently, captured the sound that would transform that moment into something even deeper, the rapid, steady beats of the baby's heart echoing through the small speaker on the machine, filling the room with a constant, vigorous rhythm. Lorenzo Barton felt something break inside his chest, not from pain, but from an emotion so intense and unfamiliar that he had to grip the edge of the stretcher to steady himself. Never, in his entire adult life dedicated exclusively to building a business empire, had he felt anything remotely like that. The heartbeats of that baby, not biologically his, someone he'd barely known for a few weeks, resonated inside him like a call he didn't know he'd been waiting to hear. "Jose Muller," she whispered, almost without realizing she was speaking aloud, testing the name for the first time with a closeness she hadn't felt until then. Mercedes looked at him, surprised by the expression on his face, his eyes brimming, his mouth slightly open, as if he too were processing a revelation bigger than just the baby's sex. For a moment, the two of them shared that instant in absolute silence, united by something that completely surpassed the limits of the temporary arrangement that had placed them under the same roof. Helen, discreet, finished the exam and stepped out for a few minutes to prepare the report, leaving them alone in the room, still steeped in recent emotion. "Are you okay?" Mercedes asked, wiping her face with the back of her hand, still lying on the exam table. "I am," Lorenzo replied, his voice hoarse, unusual. "I just never imagined hearing that would affect me this much." "He moved quite a bit when you got close," Mercedes remarked, a soft smile on her lips. "I think he already recognizes your voice." The comment, said almost teasingly, landed on Lorenzo with surprising weight. Recognize his voice. The idea that that tiny being in formation could already, in some instinctive way, associate his presence with something familiar brought a responsibility he felt instantly, like a comfortable weight on his shoulders, different from any professional responsibility he had ever carried. Leaving the clinic, they walked side by side to the car in silence, both still processing the intensity of that afternoon. Lorenzo opened the door for Mercedes, an automatic gesture of courtesy that had already become habitual between them, but now carried a different meaning, closer, more genuine. "Thank you for coming with me," Mercedes said, already seated, before he closed the door. "I think deep down I needed to share this moment with someone." "I'm the one who should thank you for letting me be part of it," Lorenzo replied. And there was in those words a sincerity so stripped of any pretense that Mercedes felt, for the first time since they had known each other, that maybe that man wasn't just helping out of compassion or guilt, but building, without fully realizing it, a genuine bond with her and with the son who hadn't even been born yet. That night, back at the penthouse, Lorenzo surprised Mercedes when he arrived from the office, carrying a small bag from a baby supply store. Inside it, a light blue little onesie, delicate, with a discreet embroidery of stars. "I saw it in the window when I went out for lunch and couldn't resist," he explained, a bit sheepish, as if afraid he had crossed some invisible line. "I know it's still early, but—" "It's beautiful," Mercedes said, holding the tiny garment in her hands, emotional again. "Jose Muller will love it." That small piece of clothing, carefully stored in the drawer Mercedes had already started organizing for the layette, became the first of many gestures Lorenzo would make in the following weeks. Gestures that, taken alone, seemed merely expressions of affection and care, but that together began to draw a pattern that later on would bring to light far more complex questions about boundaries, autonomy, and the true meaning of caring for someone without suffocating their independence. Later that same night, Mercedes called Millionaire Olsen, unable to keep the news to herself. Her mother's voice on the other end of the line broke with emotion as soon as she heard the confirmation. "Her boy, my daughter. Jose Muller, just like your grandfather. Oh, may God bless this child," Millionaire said, crying softly with joy. "And tell me, how was the appointment? Did everything go all right?" "Everything went perfectly, Mom. The doctor said he's developing really well, just as he should," replied Mercedes Bernier, carefully choosing her words, still not brave enough to explain the entire situation with Lorenzo Barton in detail. She had only mentioned that an acquaintance from work was helping with the medical expenses, avoiding going into too much detail about the move to the penthouse, fearing her mother's judgment or excessive worry. "That's great, my daughter. You deserve for things to start falling into place. God hears those who try," said Millionaire Olsen, and Mercedes Bernier felt the weight of the lie by omission, but she still didn't feel ready to explain a situation that didn't even make complete sense to herself. The next day at the office, Lorenzo Barton absent-mindedly mentioned the ultrasound results to Derek Wysocki, without going into details about who the expectant mother was. His friend, noticing the unusual sparkle in Lorenzo's eyes, looked at him curiously. "You're talking this excitedly about a baby that isn't even yours," observed Derek, half serious, half teasing. "Are you sure you're just helping, Lorenzo?" "Don't complicate things, Derek," replied Lorenzo, trying to change the subject, but not fully convincing his friend, who knew that defensive tone all too well to suspect there was much more going on than Lorenzo was willing to admit, even to himself. As the weeks passed, Lorenzo's enthusiasm about the pregnancy turned into a dedication that gradually began to exceed the limits of what Mercedes Bernier considered comfortable. It all started subtly, a more complete crib than the simple model she had chosen from the catalogue, bought without consulting her, delivered directly to the room that would be Jose Muller's. Then came the clothes, in quantities far greater than any baby would need in the first months of life, followed by a state-of-the-art stroller that replaced, without prior notice, the used model that Mercedes had managed to buy with great effort at a second-hand bazaar. "Lorenzo, I had already taken care of that," she said upon finding the new stroller assembled in the living room, still with the price tag hanging. "You didn't have to buy another one." "The other one had a worn-out safety belt," Lorenzo justified, not noticing the slightly exasperated tone in her voice. "I saw it in the ad, thought it was dangerous, and decided to replace it." "Did you look at the stroller I bought?" asked Mercedes Bernier, crossing her arms. "I chose it, I paid for it, with my money, my way." "I know, but—" Lorenzo hesitated, not fully understanding the reason for that reaction to what for him was just a gesture of care. "I just wanted to make sure everything was in perfect condition for Jose Muller. It wasn't my intention to disrespect you." Mercedes took a deep breath, trying to contain her growing irritation. She knew his intentions were good, but behind that seemingly harmless gesture there was a pattern that had been repeating for days. Decisions made without consulting her, substitutions made without warning. A silent insistence on making sure everything was under control, even when that control wasn't his. "I understand you want to help, Lorenzo, but I need you to ask me before doing things. I'm not incapable of deciding what's best for my son." "I never said you were," he replied defensively, without realizing how much that attitude reinforced exactly the behavior Mercedes was trying to point out. The disagreement didn't escalate into a heated argument at that moment, but it left a residue of tension between them that didn't fully dissipate in the following days. Mercedes, more attentive now, began to notice other signs that had previously gone unnoticed, overshadowed by the initial gratitude and the shared emotion of the ultrasound. She discovered by chance, while talking to the receptionist at the obstetrics clinic, that Lorenzo Barton had paid all future appointments in advance, including exams that hadn't even been requested by Helen yet. She also discovered that he had spoken, without her knowledge, with the cleaning company supervisor, suggesting, albeit politely, that they reduce Mercedes Bernier's workload in the last months of pregnancy, citing health issues that she herself had never authorized to be discussed with others. "You did what?" asked Mercedes Bernier, her voice raised when she finally confronted Lorenzo Barton about the matter, on a night when she returned home feeling humiliated in front of her colleague who had commented, with good intentions, about the little favor the building owner had asked on her behalf. "I just wanted you to have less weight to carry in the last few months," explained Lorenzo Barton, genuinely surprised by her reaction. "I thought it would help." "Helping would have been talking to me first," exclaimed Mercedes Bernier, feeling tears of frustration threatening to escape. "Now everyone at work thinks I can't handle my own job, that I needed you to go there and ask for a favor for me. Do you have any idea how that made me look small in front of others?" Lorenzo Barton remained silent, his expression slowly shifting from confusion to understanding, though still incomplete. He had always solved problems the same way throughout his life, identifying the obstacle and removing it with the available resources, without necessarily considering the emotional or symbolic impact of that intervention on the person who was, theoretically, being helped. "I didn't think of it that way," he finally admitted, his voice lower. "I just wanted to protect you." "I don't need to be protected all the time, Lorenzo. I need to be respected," replied Mercedes Bernier, her voice trembling between anger and exhaustion. "There's a difference between taking care of someone and deciding everything for them as if they had no voice of their own." The conversation ended without a complete resolution, and Mercedes Bernier retreated to the bedroom, feeling the weight of a contradiction she could no longer ignore. On one hand, she felt genuinely grateful for the security that help provided. On the other, she began to fear that this security came with an invisible price. the price of losing, little by little, the autonomy she had fought so hard to maintain, even amid the worst financial difficulties. During her break at work, Mercedes Bernier vented to Shakira Reynolds, telling her about the stroller incident and the conversation with the cleaning supervisor. Her friend listened in silence, stirring her coffee in the disposable cup before responding with her usual frankness. "Look, Mercedes, I know you're in a tough situation to judge because in the end the man is really helping you. But pay attention to one thing. Real help doesn't take away your voice. Real help asks before acting." Shakira Reynolds paused, looking at her friend seriously. "Have you ever stopped to think that maybe he doesn't even realize what he's doing? Rich people sometimes get so used to solving everything with money that they forget that solving things for someone is not the same as solving things with someone." "I know that, Shakira. But every time I try to complain, he gets that look like he doesn't understand what he did wrong," replied Mercedes Bernier, frustrated. "And then I feel bad for complaining, because in the end, he just wants to help." Feeling bad for complaining is exactly the problem, my friend. You start swallowing things so you don't seem ungrateful, and one day you wake up not even remembering who you were before all this, warned Shakira Reynolds, touching on a point that would echo in Mercedes Bernier's mind over the following days, like a warning she still hadn't fully processed. That conversation kept echoing in Mercedes Bernier's mind as she finished her shift, and it was with those words still resonating that she finally decided to have the most serious talk with Lorenzo Barton about the pattern of behavior she saw repeating itself. In the following days, Lorenzo tried in his own way to correct course. He started asking before making decisions related to Jose Muller, consulted Mercedes about purchases, avoided intervening directly in her work matters. But the pattern, though more subtle, hadn't disappeared completely. He kept paying bills Mercedes didn't even know existed: a routine dental appointment, a childbirth preparation course, vitamins prescribed by the doctor, always with the justification that it was already taken care of before she could even speak up. "I was going to pay for that with my own money," Mercedes said, upon discovering that the childbirth preparation course had already been paid for when she went to sign up. "I'd already set aside the exact amount for it." "I know, but I saw the opportunity and took care of it right away, so you wouldn't have to worry," Lorenzo replied, his tone laden with a goodwill that more and more sounded to Mercedes like a veiled form of control disguised as care. It was during one of those conversations, calmer than the previous ones, that Mercedes tried to explain, as clearly as possible, what really bothered her. "Lorenzo, I grew up watching my mother struggle alone to raise me and my sisters, without anyone deciding anything for her. That taught me that I need to be the owner of my own life, even when things are hard. If I let you fix everything for me now, what happens when you're not around anymore? I'll be lost again, not knowing how to handle even my own bills, because I got used to letting someone else decide everything." Lorenzo absorbed those words with a seriousness Mercedes hadn't expected. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand that what he considered care could, from another perspective, represent exactly the opposite of what he intended to offer. "I'll try to do better," he promised, and there was genuine sincerity in the promise, even though both suspected, without saying it out loud, that changing such a deeply ingrained behavior pattern wouldn't happen overnight. In the weeks that followed, a fragile balance settled between them. Lorenzo making a visible effort to consult before acting, Mercedes trying not to interpret every gesture of care as an attempt at control. One night he even asked, before scheduling a routine checkup, if she preferred another time, another day, another way to organize the schedule. A small gesture, but one Mercedes recognized as genuine effort, and for that, she thanked him with a lighter smile than she'd managed in recent weeks. Still, there were moments when the old pattern insisted on reappearing. Almost like an automatic reflex Lorenzo couldn't fully control. Once, upon learning that Mercedes intended to keep working until 2 months before the delivery to guarantee extra income, he suggested, with all the goodwill in the world, that maybe she should stop earlier, offering to cover any financial difference that would make. "I decide when to stop, Lorenzo," Mercedes replied, in a tone that no longer hid the weariness of having to repeat this constantly. "I need my own money. I need to know I can support myself without depending on anyone, because that security is the only thing that truly belongs to me in this whole story. Lorenzo Barton recoiled at that answer, acknowledging, even if grudgingly, that there was a line he kept trying to cross without fully realizing it. Once again, he promised to respect that decision, and for a while he managed to hold back, watching from a distance. With a mix of admiration and apprehension, Mercedes Bernier's determination to keep the reins in her own hands, even in the face of so many conveniences he insisted on offering. But the latent tension, though momentarily soothed, remained there like an underground current, waiting for the right moment to resurface, especially when other voices, coming from outside that apartment, began to interfere in the fragile dynamic the two of them were trying to build between gratitude, care, and Mercedes Bernier's urgent need not to lose herself in the process.